Our guest, David Nolan, has been living here in Florida for 40 years. You beat me by 5. Anyway, and he is the author of a couple of books, at least a couple of books that I know of. The Houses of St. Augustine, which I do own a copy of that, and 50 Feet in Paradise, The Booming of Florida. And he is an expert on the civil rights movement here, and this was where an awful lot of it happened. An awful lot of the change from old attitudes to new attitudes got birth. He was awarded by the governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, the Governor's Points of Light Award. How about that? And then by President Barack Obama, the President's Volunteer Service Award. So he is a man of renowned nationally, probably internationally, and certainly locally. And so it's my pleasure to introduce David Nolan.
Thank you. Now, we got the sound on? Okay. I suppose we all come from somewhere else, and I am no exception. And when I look back at why it is that I enjoy history so much, and I always say I've had more fun with history than anybody else I know, it goes back as far as my memories go. My earliest memory is actually attending the inauguration of President Harry Truman in 1949, and the depth of my knowledge is that it was a very cold day in Washington, D.C. But I picked up more along the way, and I think of a famous sports writer from the first half of the last century named John Kieran, who was on one of the popular radio programs from the golden age of radio called Information Please. He was one of their regular panelists, and he always said that he had never in his life learned anything that didn't in the long run turn out to be useful somewhere else. And I often think of this, and this goes back to some of my very early recollections from childhood. When I was young, I used to collect autographs, and I lived in a place called Bayside, which is on the far fringes of New York City. We had grass and we had trees, so it was not like Manhattan. It was a little bit like St. Augustine has become with the continuous development in all directions around it. And because we were a small town, word got around, and the local librarian heard that I had an autograph collection and said, "Why don't you come and put it on display in the library?" Which I did. And then the local newspaper office was right across the street, so they saw a potential story, and I was called up and they invited me in at age 11. And after we talked about autographs and what fun I had with them and what I thought of various world leaders and stuff, he said, "Have you seen Mrs. Corbett?" And I said, "No," and this was probably the most famous person living in Bayside. She was the widow of Gentleman Jim Corbett, the world heavyweight boxing champion of the 1890s, who defeated the great John L. Sullivan, and when he wasn't in the boxing ring, he was on stage. And he wrote an autobiography called The Roar of the Crowds, and in the 1940s it was made into a movie starring Errol Flynn, and Errol Flynn always said it was his favorite of all the movies he ever made. So I got on my bicycle, which was my usual means of transportation, and I pedaled out to 22104 Corbett Road, the street that they had named after Gentleman Jim. And I knocked on the door, and Mrs. Corbett came. Now, Mrs. Corbett never told me her age, but when she died a couple of years later, it was reported in the New York Times that she was an octogenarian. However, the latest biography of Gentleman Jim Corbett says that she was 92 years old at the time I went out there. But I was all ears, and she told me all kinds of things. And one thing that surprised me when I read her obituary was it said she had never attended any of Gentleman Jim's boxing matches because that was not considered appropriate for a lady. And here I had heard these firsthand accounts from ringside. So, and what she told me was age appropriate. She did not, for instance, tell me that Gentleman Jim Corbett's father took his life savings and betted on the match of Jim Corbett versus Bob Fitzsimmons, and that Jim Corbett lost the match, and his father lost his life savings and went home and murdered his wife and killed himself. That would not have been age appropriate for me to learn at that time. But this was also the age when television westerns were the rage. You know, you had Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley. You name it, they were there. And I watched them all, but I was interested in the real history of it, not the what we might call the fake history of it, the fake news about it. And so my mother, good soul that she was, brought me home a new book from the library, a large book called The Old West Speaks. And this was the true story of the West, and I was just enchanted with it. And I went to school the next day, and I told my best friend, I found this book. It's called The Old West Speaks by Howard R. Driggs. And he said, oh yes, Professor Driggs, he lives around the corner from me. There I was on the bicycle, pedaling up to his door. He was a very tall man in his upper 80s, and I still have the autograph he signed for me. And I don't know if he was puzzled by this 11-year-old kid, but he told me how is the story behind the book, and an even earlier book he had done. Howard Driggs was from Utah. And he was the head of an organization called the American Pioneer Trails Association that put historic markers along the route of the Pony Express and the Oregon Trail. And he was old enough that he had talked firsthand to the Pony Express riders from the 1850s and 60s and the people who followed the Oregon Trail out west. And he had published them in many books. And he said he published a book called Westward America in 1942. And it was illustrated by one of America's pioneer photographers, William Henry Jackson. And he said there was a little bit of concern because they were putting out a special autographed edition of it, but Mr. Jackson was 99 years old, and they were not sure he would make it till publication date. So I have a copy of that book, and they got William Henry Jackson to sign little tiny scraps of paper, which they bound into them. So I don't know if he actually made it to the publication date, but those are signed issues. Now, in the spirit of John Kieran and no information being useless, how did this affect my later life? Well, a few years ago, I was going through the photography collection at the St. Augustine Historical Society Library, and I found an old photograph, and it was labeled Corbett at Mayport. And I think they thought that this was some local dignitary, like a former superintendent of schools, but it wasn't. It was Gentleman Jim Corbett preparing for an 1894 boxing match in Jacksonville, and his opponent, Charlie Mitchell, made his headquarters here on Anastasia Island in the Lighthouse Park area. So again, that connected with that earlier time. Now, Professor Driggs, in his book, he eventually died, but he was the first person who ever talked to me about William Henry Jackson. And William Henry Jackson was such an influential pioneer photographer that his photographs convinced Congress to make Yellowstone the first American national park. And then what did he do? Well, you know, what do you do to make money? You go where things are happening. Where were things happening in the 1880s? St. Augustine, Florida. William Henry Jackson came down here and took some of the most beautiful photographs of Flagler-era Florida. And you still see them reprinted all of the time. So again, a few years ago, Bob and Joanne Chris-Bellert, who bought an old house that is now part of the Flagler College campus, wanted to know what their house had originally looked like because it had been moved across the street, and then, although a wooden Victorian building, it had been stuccoed over and given a red tile roof in the Florida land boom of the 1920s. And the Historical Society didn't have an old photograph of it, but I knew that William Henry Jackson, when he was here, had gone up in the towers of the Ponce de Leon Hotel and taken photographs of buildings, and this building showed in one of those photographs. And since Bob and Joanne had a kind of castle that they also owned in the Georgetown section of Washington, the next time they were there, they went to the Library of Congress, which has William Henry Jackson's photos, and they went through them and found the only known photograph of what their house looked like back before it was changed in the 1920s. So always, if you can keep these things in mind, there is some continuing relevance to them. And I always feel that one of the greatest things about any city is that if you know that you are walking in footsteps of history there. And I think how sad it is if people don't know that, that they just think they're getting from point A to point B, and they don't know that they are walking in the same footsteps as this person or this event of our history. So in 1978, I was hired to do a survey of old buildings in St. Augustine. And the conventional wisdom at that time was that we had only about 30 or 35 buildings that were important. And they were all colonial buildings, and anything after that was what they called Victorian garbage. And the idea was that if you wanted to do something nice for historic preservation in St. Augustine, you would buy one of these ugly Victorian buildings, tear it down, and build a fake colonial building on the site, and then you'd get an award from the Historical Society for being a good public citizen. So I was the kind of spoil sport that extended, out beyond those 30 or 35 colonial buildings to look at the other buildings of the city. And again, things that I knew from past experiences came useful as information there. Back when I was a teenager, they were celebrating the centennial of the Civil War in the United States. And a big thing that autograph dealers would sell then were Civil War letters. And the going rate was $1 each. And I wish I could find some old Civil War letters from St. Augustine and had bought them for $1 each and could put them in the Historical Society here, because they would be a wonderful description of our ancient city at that time. But I didn't. But I did try, within the limits of my allowance, to buy the autographs of Civil War generals. Now, I couldn't buy Ulysses Grant or Robert E. Lee. They were way out of my price range. But the going rate for an ordinary run-of-the-mill Civil War general was $1. And so I would save my $1 and call up an autograph dealer in New York City and say, let me have this one, let me have that one. And one of the ones that I got was a general named John McAllister Schofield. Maybe not so run-of-the-mill, actually, because I saw his house earlier this year up at West Point. And the previous occupant of it had been Robert E. Lee, and the later occupant of it was Douglas MacArthur. He was superintendent of West Point. He was also Secretary of War, and his appointment as Secretary of War launched the move to impeach President Andrew Johnson for violating congressional regulations. And if he's remembered today, he's probably best remembered because General Schofield was the first person who recommended that Pearl Harbor be an American military base. And Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, which figured so largely in the Pearl Harbor raid in 1941, is named in his honor. So how does this have any relevance to St. Augustine? Well, we had a stack of city directories of St. Augustine going back to 1885. And a city directory is kind of like a super-duper telephone book, because not only will it give you the name and address and stuff, but it will tell you the occupation of the person in the early years. It will tell you who else lived in the house, tell you the race of the occupant. And then it has a back section where you can go by street. So you can take a house on a certain street and look up and check back who lived there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. So they're just an incredible source of information. And I picked out my 100 or so favorite buildings around town, and I decided they were worth a little more examination, and I would go through this long stack of city directories and find out who'd lived there in the 1960s, 50s, 40s, and so on. And for one, a building right behind the main campus of Flagler College, I found back in the 1904 city directory that it was the residence of John McAllister Schofield. And I said, surely this is a small world. This can't possibly be the General Schofield from the Civil War. And yes, it was. General Schofield retired as commanding general of the U.S. Army in 1896, and he retired to St. Augustine. And he lived there right behind the Ponce de Leon Hotel while working on his memoirs. He died in 1906, and lo and behold, the next occupant of the house was another Union general from the Civil War, Martin D. Hardin. And Hardin had an equally interesting career. He was a protege of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, Abraham Lincoln met his wife, Mary Todd, at a social event at the Hardin family home in Illinois. And when Hardin's father died early, Abraham Lincoln took a paternal interest in young Martin D. Hardin and saw that he got into West Point. He graduated from West Point in 1859, and his first assignment was to accompany Robert E. Lee to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to take part in the hanging of John Brown. And I understand Stonewall Jackson was also in the audience that day. So here you have a young man, 22 years old, who has seen the major actors of the Civil War that's to roil the city. And Hardin became a general in the war. He lost an arm. We had two one-armed generals, one Confederate, one Union in St. Augustine. So General Hardin lived out the rest of his life in that house, and when he died in 1923, he was one of the last surviving generals from either side on the Civil War. So these are just some of the things that have happened. Now, as fate always seems to determine, no sooner had I put the last jot and tittle and period on a lengthy history of the building than somebody wanted to tear it down. Because it was inconveniently located, and the college wanted to build a dormitory on that block, taking down not only the Schofield House, which had originally been built for the manager of the Ponce de Leon Hotel, but also the building on the other corner, which had been built for the hotel physician, and one in the middle of the block, which had been built for the hotel housekeeper, and then one around the corner, which was called the Ponce de Leon Cottage, where if you came during the winter season and you didn't want to be crammed in a hotel room, you could rent this very large cottage and spend your season there. So I found that it's not always a situation where you get cheered for finding out interesting history. I remember one of the college spokesmen, it's still vivid in my ear, "These allegedly historic buildings," but it was one of the great preservation battles of the 1980s, and I still have fond memories of my daughter getting up to read a poem by Rachel Field called "I Like Old Houses Best, Don't You?" And the Union General's house is still there. So after it was decided that it had to be preserved, the college went ahead and fixed it up. And when they finished, they had an open house for it. And of course, I went down, though I didn't feel like I was the most welcome person. But my friend Tom King, who used to be editor of the St. Augustine paper and was a prince of a man, was there. And Tom was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And the word Union generals would just not come out of his mouth. So he'd say, "Here is the general's house." And I still occasionally will see references to the general's house. And St. Augustine is the military headquarters of Florida. We have more general's houses than you can shake a stick at, but we have one Union general's house, and that's a true, historic oddity and something that ought to be remembered. But I remember going through the house, and up on the mantelpiece, they had pictures of the two generals, General Schofield and General Hardin. And then on the other side of the mantel, they had photographs of two Confederate generals who had absolutely nothing to do with the house. But I guess that, equal time or something. And I remember another time I see Pat Hamilton and other members of the family here, and the house where their parents lived on the corner of Bridge and Whedon Street was one of the wonderful Victorian houses of St. Augustine. And as I looked into the history of that neighborhood, I looked back into the ownership of that property. And in 1867, I found it was purchased by a man named John Hay. And I said, surely this is not the John Hay who was private secretary to Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State for Theodore Roosevelt and the architect of the open door policy to China. So I went to the library and I got a biography of John Hay, and sure enough, in 1867, after Lincoln had been assassinated, John Hay took a diplomatic post in Paris, France, and that was the signature that I saw on the deed there was John Hay, Paris, France. John Hay had bought that whole piece of property, a 5-acre tract there, in an interesting way during the Civil War. You know, St. Augustine's Confederate history was exceedingly brief in the Civil War. We were part of the Confederacy from 1861 to 1862. And then from 1862 till 1865, we were back as a part of the Union. And there was an election coming up in 1864, and politicians will always figure the angles, right? And so they looked at Florida and they said, if we could readmit Florida to the Union, you know, they could have a congressman and 2 senators, and if they were our kind of people, you know, that would favor our balance of power in Washington. And they decided that the ideal congressman from Florida would be Abraham Lincoln's private secretary, John Hay. Now, he didn't actually live in Florida, but there was all of this land that Confederates were not paying taxes on because it was occupied by the Union. And so it was going up for tax sale, and John Hay bought that 5-acre orange grove there around Bridge and Whedon Streets in St. Augustine. And this qualified him as a Florida resident, and he came down and prepared to run for Congress. But the tides of battle did not go favorably towards that. There was a famous battle at Olustee that the Union forces lost. It was decided Florida was not ready to come back into the Union, and hence John Hay missed his opportunity to become a congressman at that young age. But so I went through, I then became a slight John Hay nut, you know, and they've published his correspondence and his diaries and various things, and I looked at them, and I found letters that he wrote to his orange grove manager saying, why is it that every year you tell me you had a good crop, but never do you send me any money? So after a few years, he sold it. And he sold it to another name that was familiar to me. He sold it to General Henry Shelton Sanford, for whom Sanford, Florida is named. Now, Sanford was Abraham Lincoln's chief diplomatic troubleshooter in Europe during the Civil War. It was Sanford who went to the Italian liberator Giuseppe Garibaldi and conveyed the invitation to come here and be the commander of the Union Army, and Garibaldi did not accept the offer. Sanford had a problem in those days in the courts of Europe. You know, all the diplomats in Europe came from the royalty or the nobility. It was Prince somebody or Duke somebody or Baron somebody. And then down at the bottom of the pecking order was Mr. Sanford, who owned a sewing machine factory in Connecticut. You know, he was not related to any kings. So he decided he needed to have something to be done. Well, he also owned a company that produced very fine cannon. So he presented 3 of his finest cannon to the Minnesota State Militia, and in gratitude, they made him an honorary Major General. And ever afterwards, he was known as Major General Henry Shelton Sanford. So, and he left his name on the land there. Darien has lived for many years on Sanford Street, and that is the origin of that street name here in St. Augustine, Florida. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, they had a program in the country called urban renewal. And it is almost universally reviled among historic preservationists now because it involved running a bulldozer through the old sections of every city they could get away with it. And St. Augustine, although we're the ancient city, we were not free of that. In fact, we had quite an active urban renewal program here, but it came in different costumes. Instead of demolishing old buildings and putting up high-rise public housing projects, we demolished old buildings and put up fake colonial buildings. So St. George Street, which had been the downtown Main Street with Western Auto and Sears Roebuck and places like that, all of a sudden became our major tourist area. In the course of tearing down those buildings, we lost quite a bit. The most famous 20th century artist from St. Augustine, I'm sure, is a man named Earl Cunningham. They used to call him the crusty dragon of St. George Street because he would look out the window of his shop, and if he didn't like your looks, he wouldn't open the door. Even if you're right there, you wouldn't get in. But nowadays they call him Grandpa Moses because they do joint exhibits around the country of his artwork and the artwork of Grandma Moses because there are certain similarities. And there's a whole museum in Orlando devoted to his work. But you won't find his work here. It became too valuable, and so they sold it. Nor will you find his home and studio on St. George Street because it was demolished in the name of restoration and a fake colonial building where I at last thought you could get a glass of wine if you were thirsty, was built in its place. So St. Augustine did not escape urban renewal and the damage that it did. Now, one of the things that I knew about St. Augustine when I came here was that it had a very rich civil rights history. And it's a good thing I knew it before I came here because I didn't learn anything about it after I came here. It was not spoken of. I remember asking one of my colleagues at Government House in the Historic Preservation Board, what did you do during the demonstrations in 1964? And he got a very proud look on his face. He said, absolutely nothing. We went out the back door to the parking lot. We looked neither left nor right. We got in our car and we went home. And I suppose I was not sufficiently praising him or something, but this was kind of the attitude among some of the more enlightened people, presumably in town. So it became one of the first things when I was hired down at Government House. I was told two things. I was told, don't waste any time in Lincolnville. There's no history down there. And I was told you must never mention the name of Martin Luther King in St. Augustine. And I was obviously the wrong person to tell. And to me, one of the great pleasures of being a historian in St. Augustine is that you can still, although less frequently than you could 40 years ago or 30 years ago, you can walk down the street and walk past people who helped to change American history and change it for the better. You know, it's odd when you look at some of the aspects of our history, and in every February all around the country they celebrate Black History Month, except here. Here we celebrate Pedro Menendez's birthday. And you know, Pedro Menendez is the man who came nearby here and slaughtered the French. He said, not because they're Frenchmen, but because they are Lutherans. And I always think how nice it is that we no longer execute Lutherans here. I even drive past their church and it's still standing. You know, it was a long time before we praised Martin Luther King here. We have an award, the city's highest award, called the Order of La Florida. And from the time it was established in the 1970s up until 2013, it was only awarded to white people. It came to be known rather sarcastically as the White Folks Award. And I looked at it every time I went down to a city commission meeting, and it was sitting on the back. And it was not until 2013 that for the first time a black person received that honor. But the richness, you know, the gratefulness that I feel towards the people who taught me about the civil rights history of St. Augustine is just incredible. Henry Twine, who chaired the first meeting where Dr. Martin Luther King spoke here in May of 1964, and later was president of the NAACP, and then he served on the city commission, and he became the first black vice mayor of St. Augustine. And he was one of my great history teachers. I always consider him a parking lot historian, because it seems like after whatever meeting was over, he and I would stand in the parking lot, and he would give me these gems of history. I remember him saying that when Dr. Martin Luther King came here, so many people wanted to hear him speak that no single church was large enough to hold all of them. So they got St. Paul AME Church and the First Baptist Church, which was around the corner, and they held rallies there simultaneously, and they shuttled Dr. King out the back door of one church and in the back door of the other, so everyone who wanted to hear him would have a chance. And he told me that, we were not idiots when it came to publicity or promotion. We knew that if you wanted to get publicity, you went to where the media people were. And where were the media people? They were staying at the brand new hotel on the bayfront, the Monson Motor Lodge. And he said that we were trying to get the Civil Rights Act passed, and it dealt with segregated hotels and motels and restaurants, and the Monson was all of them, and there were the media people, so we made it the focal point for our demonstrations. He said, we also knew that if you did something one day, it would be on the front page of the paper. If you did the same thing the next day, it'd be on the back page of the paper. And if you did it the third day, it wouldn't be in the paper at all. So he said we would hold a strategy meeting every night, and we'd try to decide what would be a kind of a new twist, a new wrinkle we could put on it so it would still be considered newsworthy the next day. He said finally at one of our meetings, somebody said, the Monson has this postage stamp size swimming pool. Why don't we have a swim in there? And they discussed it and decided it was a pretty good idea. And then he said, as the meeting was about to break up, they looked around the room and they realized there was nobody in that room who knew how to swim. He said they were not about to jump in that swimming pool with all the tension and violence in St. Augustine, not knowing how to swim. So he said that Hosea Williams, who was one of Dr. King's firebrands, said, I know some black people in Georgia who know how to swim. We'll send for them. So he said it was very well planned out and scripted, that there was in those days a legal fiction that if you were a registered guest at a motel, you could have guests come in and use the facilities. So they got two ringers, two white civil rights workers from Atlanta who were not known here, and they had them come down surreptitiously and register as guests at the Monson Motel. And so you have to picture this as Henry described it to me. You have these two white civil rights workers peering out a crack in the door, looking for a car with Georgia license plates to pull up and disgorge several black people in bathing suits next to the swimming pool. And then the whites will run out and say, it's okay, they're our guests, it's okay. And so this was how it was supposed to go down. But Henry said that the closer and closer they got to the time, the more and more scared they got. They said, those people may be dead before they ever hit the water. So they decided they needed some decoys. And who did they have? Well, they probably had the perfect decoys. Everybody has heard of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right? There's also a letter from the St. Augustine jail. And he wrote it after he was arrested on the steps of the Monson Motel restaurant on June 11th. And he wrote to his friend, Rabbi Israel Dresner in New Jersey. And Rabbi Dresner had worked with him on civil rights activities before and had Dr. King up there to speak in New Jersey. And he said, Cy, I know that you're about to go to a meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in Atlantic City. And I want you to urge the rabbis to come down here to St. Augustine and take part in our movement. So about 15 of America's most distinguished Reformed Jewish rabbis answered the call and came down to St. Augustine, and they were to be the decoys. The Monson was basically 2 blocks long. They blocked off a street in the middle for it. And down at this end was the swimming pool where the swim-in was to be, and in the middle was the old restaurant. So the rabbis were to go up and have a pray-in at the restaurant to distract attention so then people could go jump in the pool. Well, it worked perfectly. The manager of the motel was a Baptist deacon, and he was having culture shock. He said, no, you're not going to pray on my property. And he was hitting people and cursing them and demanding they be arrested. And then somebody said, oh my God, look at the swimming pool. And there, sure enough, were black and white together swimming in his pool. And the manager went and got 2 jugs of muriatic acid and went around saying, this is acid, this is acid. And it became the most famous photograph ever taken in St. Augustine. It's reprinted every year. And somebody said that manager should probably have gotten a Best Supporting Actor award because that photograph ran on the front page of the Washington, D.C. newspaper the day the Senate went to vote to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So if there had been anyone wavering or leaning, they just had to look at that picture on the front page of the paper and say, this is not the America we want. Let's pass that law. So to me, that was St. Augustine's greatest gift to America, greatest positive gift to America. And to learn about it from people who took part in it was a treat for a historian that it's hard to imagine there's a better one going around. Rabbi Dresner, who received that letter from the St. Augustine jail from Dr. King, has been down here a few times, and he is also a wonderful source of stories. I remember he said that he had gone down to southwest Georgia in the Albany, Georgia area in 1962 to work with Dr. King. And he had gone around with Dr. King to the many black churches there, and he listened when Dr. King spoke. And you know how ministers are, you know, you get a certain riff and it's so good you use it in the next place and the next place. And one of the lines that Dr. King used was, let freedom ring. And so Rabbi Dresner thought that was pretty good, and he went home to New Jersey, and he went around to speak at churches and synagogues there to share what he had learned on the civil rights front lines with Dr. Martin Luther King. And he would always say, and let freedom ring, let freedom ring. Well, come August 28, 1963, there is this huge march on Washington, and Martin Luther King gives one of the most famous speeches in American history. And we remember it as I Have a Dream, but it has a second chorus repeated there, which is, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia, where the Ku Klux Klan was organized. And so a headline appeared in a New Jersey paper, Rabbi Dresner said, Dr. King quotes local rabbi. Now, one of the things, I suppose people might say I have a fixation on civil rights, but that's not true. I just think it was the most important ignored part of St. Augustine's history. But there are many other parts as well. When I came down here, we lived at Crescent Beach, right around the corner from the beach house that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings had bought with money she made from The Yearling, which was the #1 bestseller of 1938 and the #6 bestseller of 1939. And after World War II, when her second husband, Norton Baskin, ran the Dolphin Restaurant at Marineland here, that became her permanent home. I have constant disputes with people at the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings State Historic Society, or State Historic Site in Cross Creek, who would maybe like you to think that she lived there and only there her entire life. But that was part of her life, but a very important part of her life was Crescent Beach. And again, because she wasn't a colonial figure, she was not considered very historic. And so in the late 1980s, when her house came up for sale, I remember the way they priced it was they took the front footage value of beachfront property. I think at that time it was $2,000 a front foot. And it was a double lot, so it came out to $400,000. And then they got a contractor to tell them how much it would cost to demolish this unsightly building there, where Marjorie had hosted Robert Frost and Ernest Hemingway and Zora Neale Hurston and Dylan Thomas and a who's who of modern literature. And they subtracted that and put it up for sale for $330,000. And real estate people are not always my heroes, but Pat Hamilton is one of my heroes because he found the right buyer for that just at the time when somebody else might have had the idea of buying it and demolishing it. So we still have that great literary landmark down here. And Ruth Streeter, who was the owner in recent years, has been very generous about having fundraising events out there. And so it's also a part of the community as well as just a place that somebody owns off the beaten track. Marjorie, while she was here, became friendly with Zora Neale Hurston. Now, Zora Neale Hurston, I used to tell people about Zora Neale Hurston back in the 1970s, and they would say, now, who is this Nora Zeal Thurston? But fewer people ask that today because she has become so internationally famous. But Zora Neale Hurston was kind of the great Greek tragedy of Florida history. She was born not in Eatonville, Florida, as she always claimed, but in a place called Notasulga, Alabama, which is a few miles north of Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington had his college. And she grew up in Eatonville and also in Jacksonville. She became a prominent figure in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. And in the 1930s, she became the most widely published black woman author of the century. Then she hit a hard patch. And she wound up in 1950 working as a maid in a ritzy section of Miami. And her employer was surprised to find a copy of the Saturday Evening Post with a story by her maid in it. And she died in a welfare home in Fort Pierce, Florida, and was buried in an unmarked grave in 1960. And that grave stayed unmarked for more than a dozen years until the novelist Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple and was a great admirer of Hurston, went down and located the grave site and had a marker put on it which says Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South, and has her wrong date of birth because Zora always lied about her age. And in the increasing amount, she was 20 years younger than she actually was, according to her last wedding certificate. But I remember in 1977 going down there and making our way through that cemetery and getting sand spurs up to my knees. Now if you go down, it's like Zora World. In fact, the whole town of Fort Pierce, in fact, the Wells Fargo Bank in downtown Fort Pierce has a huge mural on the outside featuring Zora Neale Hurston, the woman who died in the welfare home in Fort Pierce. And all over town, there are Zora Neale Hurston markers. This is where her funeral was held. This is where she worked. This is where she lived and stuff. So, you know, in the long run, she has had the last laugh, and her most famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, has long since sold over 1 million copies. And sales like that will make you rich, but I think, you know, how sorry that she didn't get a little bit of that while she was still around. But anyhow, this is one of our things. Now, something that frustrated me, because I always want to stick a place with a name, is where did Zora Neale Hurston live in St. Augustine? Because she had taught here in 1942 at the time she became friendly with Marjorie Rawlings. But city directories were not put out during World War II, so I couldn't find her there. She didn't have her own telephone, so although we have a telephone book, you couldn't look up Zora Neale Hurston and find an address. She rented property, so you couldn't go out to the courthouse and look through the land records and find what she owed, what she owned. So it was a source of huge frustration to me for about 15 years, until finally in the early 1990s I was giving a talk on Black history at St. Paul AME Church downtown. And I talked about some of the famous black people who had been here, Frederick Douglass and others. And then I got to the name of Zora Neale Hurston. I said, I would love to know where Zora Neale Hurston lived. And 2 hands went up in the audience. And I still have my notes from that talk. And in the margin, I've written down, 2-story house over the railroad track. Mr. Slappy lives there now. And so I went out the next day and checked out all of these things. And yes, indeed, that was the house. And if you go out there today, you'll see there is a historic marker on it. And if you go up and tap on the walls, you'll probably see termites come out of it because it is, it has one of those enemies that we have to be conscious of in historic preservation: hurricanes, termites, trees falling on it, fire, all of these things that have destroyed historic places. So that was another one of the tremendous things. Now, I have to say, Eatonville, Florida, has her sort of hometown was almost completely demolished. They were going to run the freeway through there and just get rid of everything. And, at the last minute, just by their fingernails, they saved a couple of things, and they have a museum, and they have an annual Zora Neale Hurston Festival that draws tens of thousands of people. And is one of the important cultural events of Florida every year. And Mrs. N.Y. Nathiri is the grande dame in charge of the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. And every time I get an article about Zora Neale Hurston in St. Augustine, I send it to Mrs. Nathiri, and she never writes back. As far as she's concerned, Zora Neale Hurston's life is bounded by the city limits of Eatonville, and St. Augustine does not figure in this. But in fact, St. Augustine did play an important role in the life of Zora Neale Hurston. Finally, let me say, because they asked that I leave some time for questions and answers, though I assured them I could drone on endlessly, one of the things that I am proudest of in St. Augustine is that we now have a freedom trail of historic sites of the civil rights movement. And like so many things, this came sort of in reaction to a negative thing. When it was proposed in the late 1990s to demolish the Monson Motel, and in the workings of our government, if you want to demolish a building, they put you through the torture of many meetings. And so I sat through meeting after meeting after meeting, urging them not to do it. And I recall every meeting, the architect for the other side would say the same thing. He'd say, "No historic significance. No historic significance." And I thought, maybe if we could put historic markers on these places, at least he'd have to, make the effort to say something else. So, I went around to all of the logical places to see if we couldn't get money to do a freedom trail and mark these sites. And nobody was interested. As I was told, that's not real history. That's not real history. Well, it was real to me. And finally, the younger generation came along. Thank God for the younger generation. And they said, "Why don't you go to the biggest employer in town and ask them to give you money?" And I said, "Oh, sure." They said, "No, we're serious. Go to Northrop Grumman, and we'll make an appointment for you, and you can go tell them how important this is and see if they'll finance it." So I was still dubious, but we went out there, and we got a fairly nice reception, and they agreed to fund 10 Freedom Trail markers. So we went around doing them. I always remember we were going to have them publicly launched on the anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act on July the 2nd. And on July the 1st, I was out there as the unskilled labor with Mr. Smith, who knew what he was doing, and we were putting up those markers. As soon as we got them done, we got a letter from the city saying, "Don't do anything without giving us 2 weeks advance notice." But everything had been scheduled. And so we had our luncheon the next day, and it just so happened that Northrop Grumman had just appointed a new vice president, and he had literally just flown into town, and almost the first thing he did in St. Augustine was to come to our Freedom Trail luncheon. And he listened. We had the late Dan Warren, an attorney from Daytona Beach, who'd written a book called "If It Takes All Summer to Speak." This new vice president, Rick Matthews, got there, and he listened to this, and he got up afterwards and said, "This is not just black history. This is American history. And we love what you're doing, and we'll be glad to give you an equal amount next year for it." So we did that, and then we got a third year. So there are now 30 Freedom Trail markers around the city, and I'm happy to say we haven't yet lost any of those buildings. So, I never say never, because things always happen. but at least we have given them a certain additional lifespan, and we have given St. Augustine something to be proud of. And when I look at reports, I know the University of Florida recently boasted that they had spent $20 million in our tourist trap area up on St. George Street, and I think, boy, I could do something better than that with just a fraction. You know, what if, for instance, St. Augustine has a wonderful history of artists, including banning them for many years, but, you know, a lot of our restoration work depends on the work of artists to show us what the buildings looked like in earlier times, particularly before photography came into being. So I would love to see a series of markers like the ones we have for the Freedom Trail that would have on them the paintings by various artists placed at the place from which they had done it. And then Tom Graham recently wrote a book the University Press published about silent filmmaking in St. Augustine. And again, this is not something you hear about on our tour trains or whatever, but you know, Tom Mix was here. He was playing an Indian before he became famous as the movie Cowboy. And Ethel Barrymore was here. And Billie Burke was here before she played Glinda the Good in The Wizard of Oz. And Rudolph Valentino was here when he was still playing a villain instead of the great Latin lover. And these were made at places like the Ponce de Leon Hotel, the Markland Estate next door, the Three Oaks Estate down at the south end of Lincolnville, Villa Zareta on King Street. And how wonderful to have scenes from some of these movies showing those places and having a film trail around the city. And finally, of course, what about a literary trail? You know, that would let people know that books have been written about here, that authors have lived here, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, I wait for the next generation to come along and do that. I'm not volunteering to do any of these. I am 71 years old and I feel it. You know, it seems to me that our goal should be not to leave St. Augustine less than we found it. And we are all the time particularly conscious now, you know, we have hurricanes, we have fires, we have termite, we have all of these things, and we have idiots who just, you know, think that the bulldozer was the greatest invention of the 20th century. We have all of these things working against it. And to me, the true heroes are the people who stand up and say, no, stop, think about it, learn about it, don't destroy it. I see one of my heroes, Melinda Raconce here. She's kept the North City neighborhood as safe as can be for 30 or more years now. You know, and these are the people who make a contribution to St. Augustine not becoming less as we pass it on to the next generation. So I have run my mouth long enough, and if there are any questions, I'm glad to take them.
Please, let's thank David.